it's a problem because it erodes. It basically mix up to two different roles. There are to a certain extent should be split, it should be separated, and when we mix that up, and with the underlying message being, if you don't want to have issues, criminal issues, you should pay your taxes. And when sometimes it's your taxes is just what we've described as aggressive tax positions, and they are not really due, then we have a problem. Another
Miguel,
strategy, yes.
Can I step in here?
Sure.
Because I think we skipped some slides.
Yeah. Yes, we did.
So if we go one step back and look at this slide, which is I call it it looks like a little bit like a snake, but it's also, you can look at it as a kind of monopoly. There's a start and there's a finish. The start is saying the right to be informed, and the finish is the right to have a proper representation in place. So we try to map here what are the taxpayers' rights, and the dotted lines do indicate what erodes these taxpayers' rights on its way to claim its rights to the finish line. So the right to be informed, I think is the stage of an audit being used or abused by government to collect information which is used later on for criminal charges. The right to quality services, one illustration I want to give you, if you talk to a tax authority's bots instead of a human being, is that a right proper quality of being serviced. The right to not pay more than the correct amount, how do we deal with these options realistically available, which do drive tax authorities to tax you, maybe not on facts, but more on what you should have done, the fiction, or even worse, the fairy tales they come up with, not knowing really how your business model looks like. Then the right to finality, well, if you can't neutralize the impact of tax disputes because there's no statute of limitation, how are you ever going to get out of this internal loop that nothing seems to expire and get you to a final position? Another thing is the right on privacy. I do consider the country-by-country reporting to be halfway a fishing expedition. Half of the information might not even be relevant for the purpose at hand, namely to tax you based on facts. The whole right to confidentiality here, the leakage I think was clear. There was a hack, and Philip Baker talked about it in the previous presentation on taxpayers' rights. The Bulgarian tax authorities lost, I think, 32 million data points of taxpayers, and basically the only thing the OECD was doing, saying, oh, let's not exchange information for a while until they resolve that hacked data case. Another thing is, do we have the right of access and rectification? So if, and this is a Dutch real estate Supreme Court, if the tax inspector uses an algorithm which calculates your real estate value on which you need to pay real estate tax, what portion of that algorithm is to be disclosed by the tax authorities? Is it the full cycle from data to calculation? And what if there is a certain profiling in that algorithm organized? Is that going to compromise you? Yes or no? That's a big thing. Well, the Supreme Court said basically anything with data and calculation of data, the tax authority should be very explicitly and open to. So they should disclose the whole cycle of data and the calculations to get to the value, to keep a level playing field. But their profiling of you as a taxpayer, they can still keep secret in that algorithm. And we found out that the Dutch tax authorities, but I'm sure there's more, they do have a bias of being paranoid to taxpayers not paying the right amount. So if people with a stage of paranoia do develop these algorithms, then it's not an easy game to get your taxpayers' rights organized. The right to get a legal remedy. So Hans already alluded on that. Do we have a baseball arbitration or any alternative to put us out of double tax positions? No, we don't. There's an effort, but there's a lot of challenges there. Then the right to be fair and just tax system. So you basically want to avoid double tax on the same profits simply because there's also other stakeholders at hand. And last but not least, the right to a representation. If you have a DAX 6, if that forces you to have a constant representation mode on a transaction by transaction base, that's very hard. If you put a reportable DAX 6 transaction like mandatory reporting in an EU type of setting into the database with your Dutch tax inspector and he puts it in a European database, where's your right of representation going if the Belgian tax inspector looks at it at the same time? I think, having said this, maybe I would like to open the floor to Gunnar and Luis and Miguel to comment on these examples.
If I may, yes, thank you very much. A few minor points, really, just to mention these. We've already touched base on taxpayers' rights quite exhaustively, but one thing that I think is really crucial and critical is the nemo tenetur principle, under which you're not required to actually incriminate yourself, which sort of is violated if you have an automatic exchange of information where information might go into a direction where you do not know whether criminal proceedings are pending in another jurisdiction. And the mere fact that you do this on an automatic basis and sort of automatically let people run into an open knife is something that I find rather irritating, and where I don't think we have appropriate remedies. I think on a domestic level, you can actually always accommodate the underlying human rights aspects. But if you want to do this in an international scenario, I think the investigation side is not interlinked as it should be, and gives you no chance to actually take the same precautions that you would be able to do on a domestic level. And I think this is a massive threat that we're seeing. And as you also said, I think the fact that CBC reporting was not meant to be shared publicly when it was first introduced, and that debate is now open, also shows that once you sort of seed a certain plant, you kind of lose control of what will grow from it, and where violations of taxpayers' rights might apparently happen without you having any control over it in the end. I think that's from my end.
May I?
Go ahead, Luis.
Yes. Well, there are so many issues here, but I think that the question of right of confidentiality should be considered, especially on an international scenario, because each country has a level of confidentiality. For instance, it's known that in some Nordic countries, a taxpayer is supposed to know what his neighbor is paying in taxes, and this is his right. In other countries in South America, for the same reality is impossible, because you may even get afraid of being kidnapped if somebody knows about your wealth or your income. So there are different levels of confidentiality. So when you talk about an international scenario, what I would really consider is the exchange of information, and how whether taxpayers' rights are considered in this case. Are taxpayers allowed to at least oppose an exchange of information? Should not due process of law be included in your charter here as a basic taxpayer right to say a taxpayer must be heard before an information is exchanged? I would say in both sides, not only before an information is given, but also when information is asked. Because since one of the authority is asking for something, the taxpayer should be heard to say, hey, this question is misleading. You should reformulate the question, or you should complete the question for you to have an accurate information. So the due process of law is something which is also to be considered when you talk about taxpayers' rights on this international scenario of exchange of information. I'm saying this because presently we are seeing countries signing happily multilateral conventions on exchange of information, and they are practicing this exchange of information, and no filters are being applied, and taxpayers are simply not heard. This, I think, is a very relevant issue in our panel here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Luis. Miguel, any thoughts, Gunnar?
Yeah,
before we move on.
If I may, and I've talked already a little bit. I think it's both in the national or in the international scenario. I think the alignment of the incentives matters, and I think there's a misalignment of incentives between the state that is supposed to give away the information and the state that is willing to receive, and that is probably this misalignment of incentives is also not playing in favor of the taxpayer when we think about exchange of information. On the domestic side, I was covering the issue of protecting taxpayers' rights by creating precedence rules, or at least separating the issues of tax audits versus tax criminal investigations. I think there's also something to be done at the level of the incentives when we think of how are the tax authorities, how the taxman is earning his or her income, and whether there are incentives on the volume of audits and not as much on the correctness of the positions that are being litigated by the tax authorities. And unfortunately, in a lot of countries, the taxman makes money out of how much millions he is currently auditing, and not as much of how right he is in when he goes to court and litigates the tax authorities' positions.
Thanks very much, Miguel. We have Martin raising a question to the panel and speakers, whether there are countries, in which countries can taxpayers legally and even more important, successfully appeal against the use of tax data illegally obtained by tax administration. So an example we have in Holland, when the police and the tax authorities join forces, what is then the position in terms of tax data being configured and collected? Are there countries where actually that illegal collection of data can be successfully challenged by taxpayers? Anyone?
A concrete example of challenging, I'm not informed. What I'm informed is that in Uruguay, there is something very interesting, that for the issue I mentioned about exchange of information, the taxpayer has the right of being heard before any information is exchanged. This is something from Uruguay, is what I'm aware.
So Daniel Erasmus here. Hi, everyone. From a South African perspective, the Constitution creates an opportunity to challenge any unlawfully obtained evidence, but there's no guarantee. It goes to the heart of what is in the interests of justice. And so there are a number of loops or hoops that have to be jumped through, but that would be your typical challenge. And the South African Tax Administration Act is drafted in such a manner that as much as audited information is passed over to the Criminal Investigations Division, the taxpayer has to be informed, because in your typical civil audit process, you are in essence being compelled to make information available that could be incriminating. And that's where the catch comes in. And so that particular concept has been well thrashed out in the Canadian courts, where the Canadian Constitution has a similar provision. And there is an opportunity there to challenge what information is being shifted from the authorities in doing your typical audit and pushing it on to criminal investigations. Criminal investigations would typically be driven by your classic sort of search and seizure powers, where you are being compelled to make information available in an audit. It goes much further. And so what I always advise clients or corporations in the process of an audit is make that point very clear in the exchange of information with the authorities, to say that you are being compelled to make the information available, and should it ever be contemplated to be used for any type of criminal investigation, that your rights are reserved and that they would be curtailed in making everything available.
Thanks very much, Daniel.
If I may, a quick word on this, actually. We have many jurisdictions in Germany. Surely there's one where illegally obtained information may be struck out from being used under certain prerequisites in trials, but the hurdles for this are actually quite high. And even when it comes to information that you need to provide, and getting rid of the obligation to provide information with certain prerequisites, we have seen that in practice it is nigh impossible to get tax authorities of whatever color or location eliminated from getting information that you have to automatically convey to the German revenue. And even if you can prove that some of that information has subsequently landed where it's not supposed to be, such as in the media, we've seen that it's very, very difficult to prevent that information from being shared, even on that basis, so long as you cannot positively prove where it was leaked. And that sort of is quite irritating, because again, you're being exposed to something that you're not supposed to be exposed to, and there's literally nothing that you can do about it.
Gunnar, a question here. In how many cases in Germany does this what you just explained is actually happening? Is it the exception, or is it quite a normal routine to see that happening?
No, it is, luckily, I have to say, the exception that you actually get even to the point where information that's not supposed to go out is in fact leaked. But it happens ever more frequently in the last couple of years, and it is very, very difficult to then manifest your taxpayers' rights in making sure that this does not at least happen again. And there are some precedents in case law which sort of indicates that it's not a singular event, but something that happens more and more often, and you see more of these cases sprouting up, which it's still a very small fraction of whatever we see, but you do see that it happens, and I think that's an alarming trend.
Yeah, I think as part of transparency, and we're going to talk about that next Tuesday on transparency and good corporate citizen. There's obviously a few examples. One I know from the press where Microsoft was on the verge of buying Navision in Denmark, and already I think today, around the day that transaction took place, some newspaper article was already mentioning the IP of Navision would be migrated to Ireland, leaving a lot of bad press on both Navision as well as Microsoft in the public domain, and no one really was officially known with where the leak was. So I guess that in that kind of scenarios, you have big reputational issues to deal with, and the communication with the public domain is never easy from that perspective. So the means in which journalists or press is being used as a means to pressure taxpayers to do certain things or to reveal certain things to the public domain seems to be an even battle if once that hit the public domain. Any thoughts on that? Okay, maybe this is a good time to move on to the next slide. So this digitalization in the mindset of taxpayers' rights is kind of important. So if we look at the normal cycle Anna already disclosed in the beginning, and we take an intercompany transaction with a year-end and a corporate income tax, followed by some audits and maps, and maybe preceded by some APAs, then that's a normal cycle. As we all know, sometimes the time between transaction and resolving it through a map or an EU arbitration convention could take up to 12 years if you follow the time slots which are described and prescribed in the EU arbitration convention. If we would move fast forward to the next slide, then you get into a different dynamics when once the tax authorities in Brazil is definitely the how do you say, the writing on the wall, where intercompany transactions, once you make the booking, the Brazilian tax authorities are already looking over your shoulders. So the fact that you still produce accounts and file a corporate income tax return, probably they've already reconstrued based on the transactions what they expect you to pay, and any outlier will be thrown out of the system on a real-time base. So the validation of what is expected versus what the data is you have in the system might actually create a very short cycle, which gets shortened quite dramatically from about 12 years to 18 months. This is just a big statement by me, but I think everyone can visualize how data sets and the use of software by governments using X-ray type of techniques on a real-time basis will make the whole cycle of audits and as a consequence maybe maps less fruitful, and maybe as Hans already indicated, multilateral audits would take that place in a very orchestrated manner, and maybe our APAs are being replaced by some ICAP type of model on the horizon, and maybe a more accessible version of the ICAP, maybe ICAP 3.0 would be then on the horizon. So this is another impact of technology on how the nature of disputes and as a consequence, potentially the taxpayers' rights is being eroded quite significantly. Any thoughts on this cycle and the comments around it?
Well, since you quoted Brazil, just to mention, you're right. In Brazil, every single book movement I make, the tax authorities are immediately informed, movement by movement, transaction by transaction. This is done online, and also every invoice a company shall make will also be automatically informed. It is not true that because of this, tax authorities have all informations, because, for instance, they don't know whether expense is deductible, not deductible, transfer pricing adjustments, so on. So, of course, there is something for the taxpayer to do. But this is enough, for instance, for the tax authorities to know if a taxpayer first recognized a transaction, then decided, wow, this was not correct. Maybe I should review what I did. And any kind of correction I make in my books will immediately be noticed by the tax authorities. And this is also a very powerful tool for the tax authorities to know what to look for. Why has he changed his mind? What happened here? So it's not to say that it's a final work, but it's a very powerful tool that our tax authorities do have.
Luis, a question on that. How do you then, once the tax authority taps you on the shoulder and says, apparently you've been hesitating on putting a tax deductible item in or not, how does the subsequent communication go? Is that very much an automated trail of communication?
No, it's not automated. Something which I should mention also is that most companies in Brazil, in number, not in volume of revenues, but in number, most companies are not taxed on their actual profit, but rather on a deemed profit. So the number of taxpayers which are actually, let's say, audited is very reduced, about 15,000, because the remaining of taxpayers, they have this deemed, because when you have a deemed taxation, you get the revenues times some percentage which are fixed by law, and you know the tax which is due. This is very simple, also for auditing. This you can do even automatically. But the remaining taxpayers, the ones, let's say, which have 15%, it's a very small number of taxpayers, but which represent about 85% of the corporate tax revenues. So I'm talking about really huge players. They will always expect to be audited. They will have an audit and they will be visited. So it's not just, there's no need for this automatic. I'm saying you will be audited. Just wait, because you're a good client.
We still have time for a question or a comment from the speakers, panelists, or the participants. Is there any final point?
You can address your questions in chat. We still have 5 minutes.
Okay, just yeah, go ahead.
Since we have the 5 minutes, I mentioned this idea of the different cultures concerning to taxpayers' secrecy. Maybe we could make a round here to know what is the environment. As I said, for instance, in Brazil, I'm not supposed to know what my neighbor is paying. Maybe we should ask the panelists, what's the level of confidence expected from tax authorities in each country, just to compare this difference.
Very good. I think we're up for a 3 minutes break before we move back to the plenary session, and then we're going to address the tax authorities' extreme positions. So that's a continuation of some of the dialogue we had right now. So let's take a quick break and see you back in about 3-4 minutes.
Can I still, when you have to break, answer a little bit to Louis' remark because I found it
Yeah, okay.
quite
Sorry
interesting.
about that.
Louis, we had a tax policy conference in the Netherlands once where Oxfam Novib was presenting, and they actually pleaded for, they said, companies should be fully transparent. No discussion, fully transparent. And then somebody in the group asked the person from Oxfam Novib, would you actually feel the same for your individual tax account, that it'll be published everywhere? And then he said, no. That's one bridge too far, that's one bridge too far. So we still cannot do that in the Netherlands, but it gives a little bit of the attitude of the NGOs in this respect.
Two levels of measurement, Hans.
Yeah.
Okay, let's break for a few minutes and then be back on the next session starting soon.